Our wisdom lesson today comes from Theodore Roosevelt. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself for a worthy cause, who, at the best, knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who knew neither victory nor defeat.
Just before he was inaugurated, Teddy Roosevelt was shot on his way to deliver a speech. The 50-page manuscript was folded and in his coat pocket. I know that you all probably think that I do go on a bit some Sundays, but the length of that manuscript is the only thing that saved his life. The bullet did penetrate the manuscript, entering his chest, so he took out his handkerchief and coughed into it a couple of times, and there was no blood, so he assumed it had not gone into his lung, and so he stood up and delivered the talk, 90 minutes of it. The blood-stained shirt with the visible bullet hole is now a museum piece that bears testimony both to Teddy's courage and to his kind of crazy tenacity, just a little bit nuts maybe. A generation later, Franklin Roosevelt, just before he was inaugurated as president, survived an assassination attempt. Little Italian guy that was only 5'1", couldn't see him, but he emptied his revolver in Roosevelt's direction, missed Roosevelt all 6 times, but he did wound 4 people that were standing around him. Roosevelt then insisted that the 4 people be put in his car, and he got to drive them to the hospital where he stayed with them during their initial care and visited them regularly until they had fully recovered. Being president of the United States is still one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. But clearly, it becomes much more dangerous if the president is trying to lead the country in dramatic change. FDR not only suffered an assassination attempt, but not many people know there was actually a coup attempt in which corporate leaders tried to hire an army of veterans to overthrow the government because they were afraid of FDR's Democratic Socialist New Deal. Let that be a lesson to you. But when you think of the martyrs of the past century, Gandhi, King, Robert and John Kennedy, Oscar Romero, you realize that they were not killed simply because they were famous or because they were powerful, but because they were trying to change the world for the better. There's always someone on the other side of liberation. There's always someone who is profiting and making their world better by increasing poverty, by starting a war, or by maintaining classism. I remember hearing M. Scott Peck in a lecture in Louisville, Kentucky 30 years ago saying that the world is in desperate need of leaders. But anytime anyone is willing to stick their head up above the crowd, they can expect that someone in the crowd will cut their head off and hand it back to them. That people desperately need prophetic leaders, but they despise them at the same time. And of course, that doesn't mean literal martyrdom in all cases. You think about how many times that Dorothy Day was arrested for protesting against poverty and against the arms race, that Rosa Parks was arrested for fighting against racist laws. Malala was shot in the face for just going to school and advocating for girls getting education. And one of my favorites, Bree Newsom, climbed the flagpole in front of the South Carolina State House in Columbia. She did that like 2 days before I got there. It was just, I am so sorry I didn't get to meet her, but she brought the Confederate flag down shortly after the shooting at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. And my all-time favorite, Aisha Evans, who stood up to the riot police in Baton Rouge during the protests following the police shooting of Philando Castile. Call me Aisha. I've never been arrested, though the police have been called out to a number of the protests I've been involved in. So far, I've managed to avoid being picked for police action. I've never been shot, though I've certainly received any number of threats, which thankfully never materialized. Still, I can't help thinking, I must not have tried hard enough. Must not have been brave enough. Must not have stuck my neck out far enough, because people who really try to make a difference will virtually always receive ferocious opposition. I was a very young pastor when I created the only proverb that I've ever written, and you've heard me quote it several times. If you light a candle in a dark place, you will draw bugs. Or as the comedian Stephen Wright put it, for every action, there is an equal and opposite criticism. I've endured a lot of pretty toxic board meetings during my years in denominational ministry. We've solved that here. We don't have board meetings. I love it. But one of the more memorable incidents that stands out in my mind as a symbol of what I endured for 30 years as a disciple pastor. On December 26, 2004, there was a tsunami that struck in Indonesia. Killed 250,000 people almost immediately. And so I put everything else on the back burner, and in a week's time, I organized a children's choir concert that was held at Hammond's Performing Arts Center, and we raised about $50,000 for relief for Indonesia. It was the largest fundraising effort for that crisis in the denomination, and we sent it through our denomination's Week of Compassion office. At our next board meeting, a member of the church who'd been a constant critic of mine for 12 years rose and asked the question, are you really raising all this money just to pay off a debt you owe to the denomination for something? He's dead now, and I'm still mad. It's rare for me to be speechless, but anything that came to mind for me to say at that moment would have been so laced with profanity that Lewis Black would have had to have covered his ears. Evidently, other board members did speak to him privately, and I never saw him again. The 18th century English writer Samuel Johnson observed, criticism is a study by which men become important and formidable at very small expense. A critic risks nothing, but tries to make themselves seem important. People who offer little of themselves in public, people who still feel that for some reason they're not getting enough notice, enough praise, they're not admired enough, will appoint themselves to be a moral Supreme Court and throw stones at the people who are trying to accomplish good things. And by so doing, they think they're making themselves important by simply hurling insults like Statler and Waldorf. Except, of course, Statler and Waldorf are clever. I strongly suspect that most of this goes on at a subconscious level. I spoke last week at a Unitarian church in South Carolina, and I've been there several times before over the past years, but one of our hosts, someone who's frankly been an enthusiastic fan of mine, came up to me at the end of the service and enthusiastically exclaimed, "Oh, Roger, you've improved so much." I was a bit taken aback, but she just went on like she was a judge at a high school speech contest, telling me what I did better than I used to do. So I told my traveling companion about the exchange as we were driving back to Missouri the next day, and he just patently refused to believe that anyone would have been dumb enough to say that. And as if on cue, she called and on speakerphone repeated the same backhanded compliment. Now, on a conscious level, I'm confident that she thought she was offering me a compliment on my finally improving homiletic skills. But what was evident to us was that she was placing herself on a pedestal high enough to grade me. And I have been a published writer and public speaker for 40 years. It wasn't malevolent. It was just sadly lacking in self-awareness on her part, and showed a certain generosity of narcissism that I could have done without. And while I'm playing armchair psychologist, I want to share with you a belief that I've held for a long time, and I've never spoken of this before, which contradicts my former spouse's assertion that I have no unpublished thoughts. But this one, prior to today, was unpublished. I reached this conclusion 20 years before the researchers at George Mason University published the same thing. There are lots of reasons why people are shy, and all of us are shy to varying degrees in different circumstances. I can be very confident when I have a microphone and a spotlight, but in most casual social gatherings, I'm usually the one hiding in the corner wondering when I get to go home. There are very real social anxiety disorders which deserve our empathetic understanding and accommodation. But I've also been aware that an awful lot of the anonymous mail that I have received through the years, when I was able to discover who actually wrote it, it's often from someone who was so shy, or at least that's how they would describe themselves, that they would never speak in public. They never published anything. They would never serve as liturgist in church. They would never be a Sunday school teacher or an opinion writer for the newspaper because they would say they're too shy. But what's happening in those cases is just this. They know how hypercritical they are. They know what bullies they are, and they assume that other people would treat them the same way. And so they choose to never publicly offer anything of themselves, choosing instead to be emotional snipers, always hiding in the brush and throwing rocks from the other side of a wall. When I had a weekly column in the newspaper, I used to get a lot of hate mail from readers who were offended by my pleas for peace and justice. It took me many years of being wounded by these letters, what Soren Kierkegaard called being stomped to death by geese. It took me a long time to stop reading letters that came in with no return address and no signature. It was my spiritual director, Brother Luke, at the Gethsemane Monastery, who said, if the author knows that what they've written is so full of poison that they won't put their own name on it, why would you drink their poison? Just throw it away. Scott Peck was still right. The world is in desperate need of prophetic leaders, people who are willing to stand up for what is right, people who are willing to challenge the status quo, to put their name on a petition, to hold a sign in a public place, to demand change, to stand resolute in the face of the police, to climb a flagpole to remove a century-old sign of racism, to speak truth to power and wealthy people like Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein and Donald Trump. And the sad reality is that such courage is rarely rewarded, and most often it is punished. Sometimes with criticism, sometimes with being arrested and imprisoned, and sometimes even with being shot. Now, she didn't write it, but she liked this poem or prayer or meditation so much that Mother Teresa kept this on the wall of her children's home in Calcutta. She didn't write it, but it said, people are often unreasonable, irrational, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, people may accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you are successful, you will win some unfaithful friends and some genuine enemies. Succeed anyway. If you're honest and sincere, people may deceive you. Be honest and sincere anyway. What you spend years creating, others could destroy overnight. Create anyway. If you find serenity and happiness, some may be jealous, but be happy anyway. The good you do today will often be forgotten. Do good anyway. Give the best you have, and it will never be enough. Give your best anyway, because in the final analysis, it's between you and God. It was never between you and them anyway. Your critics are not always wrong, and none of us should be so lacking in humility that we're not willing to learn something from an honest critic. I put about 3,000 pages of original material online or in print every year, and you all know that in 3,000 pages, I'm not always right. I make mistakes. But what if I'm 80% on target? Should that 20% failure silence me? There are things that Gandhi, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King Jr., and Bishop Oscar Romero said that I don't agree with and I'm pretty sure was wrong. But I sure am glad they didn't shy away from public leadership because they were not 100% on target. Now, you are people of passionate views. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. I'm begging you, don't hide your light under a bushel. Don't waste your time being critical of people who aren't doing things the way you would do them if you had the courage to do them. Get out from behind the bushes. Do something powerful, something wonderful, something risky, something that expresses your convictions. 1 year ago, 15-year-old Swedish student Greta Thunberg began an every Friday strike from school to sit in front of the Swedish parliament with her sign that said simply, that sign says, "Striking for Climate." And that is 100% of the Swedish that I can read. Now she is Time's Person of the Year and probably the most well-known climate activist in the world, proving that one person armed with only conviction and courage, even a high school student, can change the world. I pray that none of them will literally become martyrs because all of them are receiving a lot of hatred spewed in their direction. But we cannot but be thankful for those who've had the courage of their convictions to risk Twitter onslaughts from our president or the potential of an assassin's bullet. I'm grateful for Greta, for Malala, for Emma Gonzalez and David Hogue, and all of those who've survived the mass murder at the Stoneman Douglas High School who are fighting for sensible gun laws. I'm also thankful for Congress members Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Iana Omar, Ayanna Presley, Rashida Tlaib, who as members of Congress are not afforded security guards, even though they regularly receive death threats. They are not always right, and in fact, I can think of a number of instances in which I'm certain they were on the wrong side of the issues. But I'm even more convinced that their voices in Congress are incredibly important, and their courage and moral leadership gives me hope for America. Oh, and thank you, David Hogue, for representing for white guys everywhere that we can still throw up a hero now and then. And while I'm at it, thank you, Colin Kaepernick, for sacrificing a multi-million-dollar career to kneel for Black Lives Matter. And thank you, whoever the anonymous whistleblower is that started the investigation of our president, one that the Trump administration is trying to out while simultaneously putting a target on their back. And thank you, Chelsea Manning, for being willing to go to prison, and Edward Snowden for being willing to live in exile, for having the courage to tell the American people about crimes committed by the American government as war crimes and espionage crimes. This is the Sunday in the year when most churches that follow the lectionary are in the midst of Advent celebrations, and today churches everywhere are talking about John the Baptist. I'm going to leave it to them to preach about history lessons today, because I'm here today looking for the current prophets that will stand up for the church and speak truth to power. Specifically, I'm looking at you, and I'll tell you what I want for Christmas is for this generation's prophets to stop being afraid. Stop being silenced by cowardly critics or by presidential tweets, and if you can bear it, even assassins' bullets. We've got work to do.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.